Ever get into one of those, on-lit debates, the kind that spiral out of control with everyone going back and forth, passionate arguments flying everywhere?
Oh, absolutely. Those threads that just suck you in.
Yeah, exactly. Today we're diving into something kind of similar, but instead of memes and emojis, we're dealing with holy pictures and theological treatises, the heavy stuff.
Sounds intriguing already.
We're unpacking excerpts from the Libri Carolini, a text written under Charlemagne way back in the 8th century. It's a deep dive into, well, a very heated debate about image veneration.
Ah, image veneration. Always a hot topic, even back then. I mean, it's fascinating how these ancient arguments still resonate today. Just imagine, take the intensity of our modern social media debates and try to picture that same energy directed at religious doctrine. Because back then, that was everything.
And for someone like Charlemagne, this wasn't some abstract theological debate either. This was a big deal. I mean, this is the Holy Roman Emperor we're talking about. He was playing a high-stakes game, religious and political, trying to outmaneuver the Byzantine emperors, especially during the iconoclast controversy.
Oh, absolutely. The Libri Carolini was definitely more than just a theological treatise. It was a power move, a strategic one. Charlemagne used it to position himself as the defender of the true faith, at least within Western Christianity, a leader with, let's say, more theological clout than those Byzantine emperors.
Right. It's like he was saying, hold my scepter while I set everyone straight on the right way to interpret religious doctrine. He really wanted to, solidify his own authority, create some distance from that Byzantine approach to images.
And you can really see that strategy in how the Libri Carolini tackles the whole image veneration issue. It goes into meticulous detail, bisecting the arguments of those who supported images, systematically taking them apart. It's honestly kind of amazing to see that level of detail, that strategic argumentation in a text from that era.
It's surprisingly relevant, even now. So let's unpack one of their main arguments against image veneration. This idea that it's a slippery slope to idolatry. It's almost like they were afraid people would start worshiping the picture itself instead of what it represented.
And that fear wasn't totally unfounded, especially considering the historical context. Remember, the Western Church was still dealing with, remnants of Roman paganism, where idols and statues were a big part of their religious practices. The Libri Carolini really reflects that anxiety, this deep concern that allowing images in worship could, well, lead people back to a path they had fought so hard to get away from.
It's like they were worried that any kind of religious imagery would just open the floodgates to paganism creeping back in.
Exactly. And they didn't just stop at these general warnings about idolatry either. They got specific, calling out figures who supported image veneration.
Like Bishop Basil of Ancyra. It's
Right.
almost too perfect, the irony of him arguing for image veneration while, apparently forgetting to mention essential doctrines like forgiveness of sins and resurrection. He leaves those out of his statement of faith.
It's a brilliant rhetorical move. They're basically saying, if you're going to add something new to the faith, shouldn't you at least reaffirm the core beliefs first? How can you be arguing about images when you're overlooking the very foundation of our belief system?
It's like advocating for a fancy new door when the whole foundation of the house is crumbling.
Precisely. And this leads us to a central theme that runs throughout the entire Libri Carolini. It really emphasizes this idea of inner devotion over, just outward rituals. It's not enough to just surround yourself with religious imagery, they're saying. True faith, it has to come from within, a deep internal connection with God.
So less about the visuals, more about really living the faith.
Exactly. The Liber Carolini argues that fearing God, really fearing God, means obeying his commands. It's about living a righteous life, not about, how would you venerate physical representations.
Makes me think about how even today we see so much outward piety, right? Like someone might be sharing inspirational quotes all over social media, but not actually living by those principles in their daily life.
That's such a good point. And the Liber Carolini would probably say that true fear of God, it's reflected in your actions, your choices, not just the symbols you're showing off.
Yeah, and they were pretty skeptical about all those stories of miracles associated with images, weren't they? It's like they were saying, even if those miracles really happened, that doesn't mean we should be worshiping images.
Right. They really push this need for critical thinking, even, or maybe especially when it comes to faith. Like there's this story they mentioned about Palamon's image. It supposedly stopped a man from committing adultery.
Oh, I think I remember that one.
Yeah, so the text doesn't actually say it didn't happen, but it questions whether that story justifies image veneration. Like, okay, interesting story, but what does this have to do with our faith, really?
It's about approaching these things with a healthy dose of skepticism. Like, That's a good story, but how does it fit into the bigger picture?
Exactly. The Libri Carolini reminds us that even back in the 8th century, people were calling for reasoned analysis, for questioning what they were being told. Don't just accept things at face value, engage with your faith. Think critically.
Which is even more relevant now than ever, right? I mean, think about how much information and misinformation we're dealing with constantly. We're bombarded with claims of miracles and divine intervention all the time. It's easy to just get swept up in it all.
And the Libri Carolini is like this voice saying, wait a minute, let's take a breath. Apply some critical thinking here. But, moving on from images and miracles, they also get into other thorny issues, like the role of women in the church.
And they did not hold back on their criticism of Harina, that woman who participated in a pro-image council. Comparing her to Athaliah, the queen who took the throne illegally, seems a bit harsh by today's standards.
It's important to remember the historical context here, of course. The role of women in society, especially in the church, was completely different back then. The Libri Carolini uses Harina's participation as this, point of contention. It's like they're saying, these pro-image people are so off base, they're ignoring the entire social and religious order.
So it's not about women in general, but using Harina's involvement to discredit the whole pro-image side.
Exactly. It's strategic. They're trying to undermine their opponents by connecting them to something that was seen as a violation of social norms back then. Really shows how intertwined theological arguments were with these broader social and political anxieties.
Look, these people can't even get the basic roles of men and women right, and you're going to trust them on matters of religious doctrine, something like that.
Exactly. They were masters at weaving together all these different arguments to make their point. But beyond those social dynamics, the text also gets into these really interesting theological nuances.
Yeah, they were very particular about the language used to describe the Trinity, and especially the Holy Spirit. I have to admit, I got a kick out of them calling out Bishop Teresius for using the phrase fellow tribe member to refer to the Holy Spirit.
It does sound a little informal, right? But that was their whole point. They're emphasizing how important precise language is when you're dealing with theology. Even small differences in wording can completely change how we understand these core doctrines.
Careful with your words when you're talking about God.
Right. It reminds me of how we are today when we're discussing something sensitive or complex. You weigh your words carefully because the topic demands that kind of precision and clarity.
And they were really hung up on that whole debate about the procession of the Holy Spirit, right? Whether it proceeds from the Father and the Son or through the Son. Seems like such a minor thing.
It seemed minor, but they made it clear that these little nuances had major implications for their whole understanding of the Trinity.
So a tiny theological quibble, but actually representing a huge rift within Christianity at the time.
Absolutely. The Libri Carolini, in choosing the phrase from the Father and the Son, that really solidified the Western Church's stance. It put them even further from the Byzantine perspective.
So while it might look like a minor disagreement on the surface, it actually speaks to a much larger divide.
Precisely. And this attention to detail, the way they pick apart language and arguments, it reveals something crucial about the Libri Carolini.
It shows how much effort they put into arguing against image veneration. It's like they weren't messing around. They wanted to build a rock-solid case.
Yeah, they weren't just throwing opinions around, were they?
Really?
It was methodical, like a legal argument, bringing in historical context, theological analysis, even social commentary to support their claims.
Like they knew all the counter-arguments in advance and were ready for them.
Yeah. Exactly. The Libri Carolini, it wasn't just some theological treatise. It was a carefully built defense of their position.
And that approach, that meticulous argumentation, it's something we could all learn from today, don't you think? Especially now, with so much information flying around, it's easy to get caught up in the heat of the moment, to go with your gut instead of thinking things through.
Oh, absolutely. The Libri Carolini, it reminds us about the importance of clear, well-reasoned arguments. Back up your views with evidence, use logic.
It's a shame, though, that a document this well-crafted, it still didn't actually settle the image debate, at least not for good. Makes me wonder, what kind of impact did it have in the long run?
Well, it might not have been the final word, but it did have a big influence on how Western Christianity developed. By taking such a strong stance against image veneration, Charlemagne, using the Libri Carolini as his voice, he really drove a wedge between Eastern and Western churches.
So even if it didn't provide an immediate solution, it had these ripple effects, these long-term consequences.
Exactly. And those arguments in the text, especially the ones about papal authority, the role of tradition, they didn't just disappear. They echoed down through history, and played a part in the Great Schism of 1054.
Wow. So even though it was about this seemingly niche theological debate, it ended up shaping the landscape of Christianity for centuries.
It really goes to show you never know how these historical events, these texts from the past, how they might influence us even today. We might not even realize it.
That's the beauty of digging into these documents, though, isn't it? They give us a glimpse into the minds of the people who came before us, their worries, their motivations. It's a way to connect with the past.
And it challenges us to examine our own perspectives, too. Which brings us to something for you, the listener, to think about. Let's say Charlemagne could time travel to our world today. What do you think he'd say about our image obsession, our billboards, our social media, everything?
Would he freak out? See it as proof that his fears were justified? Or would he be able to make sense of it, see how it fits into our modern world? It's an interesting thought. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the Libri Carolini for today. It might not give us all the answers, but it definitely gives us a lot to think about, especially as we navigate our own world of images and ideas.